Hello everyone, welcome to the second end of year video. Today I am going to talk about my best and favorite reads of 2024. We made it to the end of the year and these are some of the best things, or actually the best things that I read in 2024, and I am so excited to share this with everyone. And I just wanted to quickly say that in the previous video I think I showed this background. This will eventually become my bookshelf, which I'm very excited for. That's going to be in 2025. So yeah, I just wanted to start recording with it in the background to start seeing kind of where things fit and everything. So if you were wondering what's up with all of these empty thing here, that's going to be filled with books. I also wanted to say I'm sorry if there's a lot of reflection in my glasses. It's very late at night here, but that is because I just finished one of the books that is going to be mentioned in this list, and I wanted to wait until I was done with this book because I had a feeling that it was going to be part of the list, and I did not want to record this before that. So that's the reason why this is coming so late. I'm sorry for that, but anyways, let's just jump straight into it. And this is actually going to be a list of both my biggest surprises as well as my best books of the year. So my biggest surprises are going to be things that I was maybe not expecting so much from and that I ended up really liking, or that difference between my expectation and the end result was so big. This doesn't necessarily mean these are like the best books, but they were definitely huge surprises for me this year. And we're going to kick it off with Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, I think it's her name. This is the story about two women that are in a relationship. They've been married for a very long time, and they are dealing with the return of one of them after she was lost for months in an underwater expedition. And you follow the point of view of both of these women, one of them narrating her experiences in this submarine expedition as the events are happening, so that's more in the past, and then also her wife in the present dealing with the return of her partner, and she is just a different person. And I think this very short novel managed to really capture that kind of fear of facing this person that you've been together with for years, decades even, and they are now a completely different person to the point that you don't even recognize them, and you are not even necessarily no longer happy in the relationship, and what it means to let go of that kind of. And I don't want to spoil a lot of it because I think it's a very atmospheric, very slow burn kind of story. It's not necessarily super dramatic, but it has definitely some high moments, and I thought the ending was beautiful. I think it was very well wrapped. I liked having some answers about what happened in this expedition because I had heard that it was very kind of open ended, and I am happy to say that we definitely get to see what's going on down there. And I think both of the stories were very interesting to follow, both because one has some more like claustrophobic elements. You have this crew that's basically locked in this submarine, and they're in the bottom of the ocean, and they are just kind of passing the days and waiting to see what happens, and pondering on their survival. And then you have the wife that's on land, let's say, and she is just more dealing with the day-to-day crisis of having her wife back at home, but she's definitely different and for the worse, I think it's reasonable to say. Anyways, I really liked Our Wives Under the Sea. Very slow and dramatic piece about partnership, and I thought it was very beautiful. The next one is going to be Cadáver Exquisito, or Tender is the Flesh, as it's called, its translation in English. And this is just a super polemic, controversial in every way, shape, and form kind of book. And I feel like it's a book that no matter what you think about it, you will have big opinions because you will either really like it or be enraged by it and will want to throw it out of the window. And I think I talked about it in one of my previous videos, so I will be a bit brief, but basically you follow a dystopian society where there is a virus that makes all of the meat, animal meat, poisonous. So people basically create an industry for harvesting human flesh, and it's disgusting as that sounds. And I think what really surprised me about this book is the level of care that this topic is handled with. I think it's a very humanizing book, even though it's portraying kind of the worst of humanity and human beings stripped to the kind of bare bones of what it is to be human. It is brutal. I would check any and all the trigger warnings for this, because it definitely has everything you could imagine. So it's definitely not for everyone. But I was surprised by how well I think it was handled. That even though the things shown in the book are horrific, I think it's not glorifying violence. Quite the opposite, obviously. And the ending is extremely shocking. So I was just surprised by how rich this book was, both for discussing it with people, but also just reflecting what your own kind of stance would be in a situation as extreme as this. So that is Cadáver Exquisito. The next one is The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This is a sci-fi kind of space opera, I would say, but it's not necessarily super epic in scale. And it's following a crew, which is also found family, which I love this trope. But you're following this crew that is in charge of protecting a boy from an empire, basically. And you're not exactly sure. There are a lot of rumors as to why this boy needs to be kept away from the empire. So that is kind of the plot, I would say, of it. But there is a lot of the exploration about identity, because you have this young boy, but also you have kind of this motherly figure, and I think this older woman character was incredibly well done, and very fascinating to follow her story. You also have this other character that is more closely related to the empire, and she is in charge of some experiments that are related to this boy. I will not spoil it, but this story is so unique, and even from the start, like the prologue of these stories can be read as a short story, I would say, and it's one of the best things that I've read this year. I don't hear that much about this book besides some of the booktubers that I follow, so I would really recommend The Vanished Birds. I think it's such a beautiful story, so much emotion, so much feelings, and again, the found family elements of the story were amazing. So I would really recommend this story. It's by a POC author, so let's push more sci-fi and fantasy stories by POC authors. It also has some queer elements which were beautiful. It was, the representation was very well done, not kind of in your face and it takes over the entire story, but rather a very, I would say, tender and honest look at queer representation, and I loved it. I loved it in every way. I devoured this book so quickly, and I would really recommend it. So those are my most surprising reads of the year. So let's jump into what I would say were the best books that I read in 2024. And again, this is very exciting. It's gonna be so hard to talk in terms of ordering here. I would kind of start with the least of the best to the best of the best, if that makes any sense. But obviously these were favorites, so it's really hard to put them next to each other. I would start by, let's just start with Heartstopper Volume 5, because I would probably have the least amount of things to say about this. This was just a super cute read. I am a big fan of Heartstopper. I think this is such a good story that I would have loved having when I was younger, because the representation of queer youth is amazing. But I think it's very respectful, but it's also very mature, because it's not showing, even though it's a super fluffy story that is very happy as a whole, it doesn't shy away from important topics that need to be discussed for youth in general, but also I think especially for queer youth, regarding mental health and partnership. And I think it's super cute. And even though there is so much, like, this story couldn't be further away from how growing up was for me. I still find so much connection to these characters, and I can think back to moments of my own life and how they feel so similar to their love story. And I don't know, I think it's super cute. It's amazing. So that is Heartstopper Volume 5, and this is the second to last volume. So there is just one more coming out, and it's gonna be so sad that we won't have more Heartstopper comics. But anyways, this is an amazing story. I couldn't recommend it more. Then let's go to I Who Have Never Known Men. This was also a surprise, but it even jumped into the best category. And yeah, I don't think I have talked so much about this story, but it has become more popular recently. This is a story that, as a quick premise, because I think it's best to not know so much, but basically you're following a group of women that have been incarcerated for decades. I mean, this main character, I think she grew up and maybe was even born inside of this cage where women are again incarcerated, and you don't really know why they are there, and they don't know that either. And one day something happens and they are able to go out of the cage, and obviously they are faced with a new world, something very different to where some of them came from, like the older women in the group, but the main character in particular, who grew up in the in the cage, this outside world is completely new for her. And this was just such a page turner, both in terms of the story being very gripping, and you're always, I mean, there's this big mystery, but I will say that the story doesn't really, it's not really about why they are there, but rather what they make of it. And so, as a lot of dystopian stories, I think it's exploring how society works and how communities operate, and obviously the need of being together, but also a sense of self and being an individual in a larger group, and how the needs of the many conflict with your own personal needs. And it was such a good story. Again, I think it's very kind of slow because it's not I would say a very plot driven, but it's still very specific with its comments, and some of the things that happen in their story I think were breathtaking. And I just can't stop thinking about I Heart Never No Man. One of the best things that I read this year for sure. It's also a short book, so I think you can recommend this to a lot of people. Obviously, hard topics are being discussed, but I think for the most part, even though it's a dark premise, the story is very beautiful, and the sense of sisterhood that the main character finds with the older women, I think was amazing to read. And she is definitely a very multi-dimensional character, very different to the kind of YA female protagonists that we got a lot of in the last decade. And I don't say that as a bad thing necessarily, but I think this story is a bit older. I'm not exactly sure when it was published, maybe in the 1980s, I want to say. And it reads very differently. So don't be, if for some reason the term like dystopia reminds you of those kind of YA dystopians of the 2010s, I would say check this out, because I think it's a very mature look at the genre, and I'm sure that a lot of other books have been inspired by this, but I don't know exactly how popular this is. But anyways, an outstanding read. Um, and now we're getting to the top three, and these are actually getting to the kind of the previous ones were best of the year, but these three are basically reaching the favorites of all time category, I think. And I think between them there is actually no order. All of them get number one, because they were incredible. So let's just start with Midnight Tides by Steven Erikson. This is book 5 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, which I have hinted at in a lot of videos. I know I need to make a more deep dive into this story, because I usually don't mention so much about this, but it's hard because it's a very long, epic, complex story, and this is book 5. So what can I say without giving spoilers? But what I will say is that this is a very different story to all of the other books in the series. Even now that I'm I've read up to book 7. This one stands out on its own as almost a standalone. I think you can almost read this and appreciate it. And this is following a family that is kind of this, they live in this tribal society. They are in kind of in the higher end of this society, and there is this internal conflict, as all stories have, and there is also this external conflict with another city that they make trade with. And there is a lot of colonialism being discussed in this story, family drama, and like how the people closest to you can be both the best and worst things that happen to you. With this main, you're following 3 brothers. Uh, there is a lot of very interesting kind of contradictions and juxtapositions between what it is like to be civilized, and again, because you're following this more tribal society, there's this, I would say, traditionally considered civilized empire that they're dealing with, and like how those stereotypes can come into play in history, both for good and bad, actually. So it's again hard to talk about this, but this introduces some of my favorite characters, or one of my favorite characters in the entire series is introduced in this book. And there are so many amazing moments, both very symbolic but also very tragic, and as it is with Malasan. But this is absolutely one of my top tier Malasan books for me. But I know it's hard to talk about it, so I will not mention more than that. But amazing, amazing book. Read Malasan. The second to last one that I will mention is Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James, and I think I mentioned this in a previous video, and I think I did a really bad job at explaining what this is about, but let's try it. So, Black Leopard, Red Wolf follows a character that is in charge of tracking down a boy, and I'm not sure if you know right away who this person is, so I will keep it secret, but they are very good at tracking, so they're put in charge of tracking this boy, and that's basically what you're following. And as I said in that video, some of the things that I really loved about this book is that it feels so different to everything that I've read. It feels classical. It feels like classic fantasy, but it's different in every way to books like, I don't know, The Lord of the Rings. And you have, I mean, this story is inspired, or is heavily inspired by African mythology, and that shines so powerfully in the story, both with the cities that we visit, the kind of character archetypes, but also the monsters and creatures that pop in the story are so fascinating, and I loved reading a bit in Wikipedia about them, because this feels again so unique and so different to everything I've read, even though stories have been told with these kind of archetypes and creatures for thousands of years. So I thought that was so powerful. The character was very puzzling to follow, because the writing style, I would say, is very how to say it, like it's not very straightforward at all. So I think a lot of people bounce off this book very quickly just off the writing style. Sometimes you're in one place, and then a couple of lines later you're in a different place, both like in time and physically in another place. I really enjoyed unwrapping the mystery of who this person is, and why he's doing the things that he's doing, and the interactions that he has with people around him. I was just blown away. I read this so quickly, even though it's such a chunky book, and it's pretty fast paced, but still, like, it's a slow read, because it is not easy to read through it. I will say. Um, I will say, look up content warnings. I think if you heard me saying that Calabre Exquisito has everything in terms of content warning, this is like 10 times worse. And I hope that doesn't put, or I mean, I know it puts off people from reading this because the levels of violence portrayed in this story are unmatched. I think the brutality is very hard to read constantly, like constantly throughout the story. You are seeing especially children, but also men and women. Like no one is spared in terms of the violence that is committed to people. But I think it's done with care, and I think it's done with purpose. That obviously doesn't make it easier to read it, but you know, I personally think uh, it's done with purpose, and obviously that will land very differently to each reader. But if you, I think, can stomach it and see why it's there, this is a fascinating story. Again, also very polarizing. Some people hate it, some people love it, but I just happen to land on the camp of the lovers. So yeah, that's it. I'm really excited to continue with this trilogy. And the last book that I will talk about, and the one that kept me up tonight putting this video off, is A Little Hatred by um, what's his name, Abercrombie. And this is the seventh book that I've read in the First Law universe, but it's also the first book in this Age of Madness trilogy. And when I started reading this book, I wasn't sure that it was going to end up in this list. And this is the textbook definition of recency bias because I finished this book like 20 minutes ago, but I was blown away. Joe Abercrombie has a way of writing characters like no one else. And I know everyone in booktube says this, but it's so true. Like unless you read it, or when you read it you will see it, because it's so true how masterfully he can write dialogue and interactions between characters, even if the plot is uh, like put to the side. I could just be reading stories where people talk if they're written by him, because I think it's so interesting. And I was trying to put together why I like his stories so much, and I think for me at least he lands in a perfect balance between being super funny but super witty with his writing style. His stories are very readable and very like easy to kind of consume and be swept by, but at the same time they don't feel like frivolous, and they are actually exploring very interesting themes, in my opinion. And he has, you know, stories that deal with human condition and what motivates people, and from the micro scale to the macro scale. And even though he might not have like the most nuanced or unique things to say about what humanity is, I think he does it in such a raw and imperfect but perfect way. So I think the culmination of all of these things put together just makes his stories land for me perfectly. I think that balance is perfect. And I think the first third of this book was a bit slower for me because we're introduced to a bunch of new characters that we're going to be following in this trilogy. And even though we had, you know, the three standalones in between the first and second trilogies to set up a lot of things, I was still a bit like jarred with all the new kind of world building that is done in the first half. Sorry, in the best, yeah, the first third, I would say. But then, like, once the story hits, it starts hitting and it rolls, and it doesn't stop. It's brutal as Abercrombie is, but I also find that he also treads a very good balance with the violence in his stories. I would not say it's like a breezy, happy time read, but it's also not as dark as I think people expect, because he's sometimes called the Lord of Grimdark, I think. And I think it is grimdark, but I think it's kind of on the lighter side, and it's still a very gritty story, but it's not like horrifying to read. If anything, I think it's super exciting. The way he does combat is exciting, and the way he does like verbal combat, let's say, it's also very exciting. Like the exchanges between people are always tense, and everything is so perfect in this story. I think it's not hard to imagine that if I've read seven books and have liked most of them. and I'm very very excited to read the continuation to this book. And yeah, that is basically it. These were the best of the best of 2024, and I am very happy with my reading this year. And please let me know what books you loved to read this year, which were the best of the best, and I will find good recommendations there, I'm sure. And yeah, have a great end of year and see you later. Bye bye.